Ben stood at the bus stop, hunching his shoulders. Autumn had arrived in the city suddenly. The dark sky hung over the rooftops like a heavy blanket, and the cold wind carried the scent of damp earth and something unpleasant. He couldn't quite figure out what exactly was bothering his sense of smell, but the scent was everywhere. Rot, blood, decay. Ben shuddered and pulled his jacket tighter around himself. Next to him stood his best friend, Edward Reeves. Dark hair fell over his forehead, and in his brown eyes lurked something strange. Edward had always been a little different. Sometimes he stared at people for too long, as if studying them. Sometimes his smile seemed unnatural, too wide, too perfect. Biology today, Ben mumbled, trying to distract himself from his thoughts. I hope Miss Gray doesn't decide to show us real animal organs. Edward turned his head and smiled slowly. What? Does the sight of blood scare you? No. Ben hesitated. It's just, I don't know. Sometimes it looks too real. Edward let out a quiet chuckle and shoved his hands into his pockets. Everything in this world is real, Ben. Even the things that seem like illusions. Ben didn't have time to respond. The school bus pulled up. They climbed inside and took seats by the window. The town they lived in looked ordinary. Narrow streets, small shops, the school stadium. No one talked about anything strange, even though disappearances had become a common occurrence. Did you hear about the woman who disappeared from the house by the woods? Ben asked, watching the gray houses pass by outside. Edward lazily shrugged. Maybe she just left, or the wolves ate her. He glanced at Ben, and something flickered in his eyes. Wolves? Ben repeated. Yeah, they get hungry sometimes. Very hungry. The bus rumbled down the bumpy road leading to the school, and for a moment, Ben thought he heard a quiet giggle from the back seat. He turned around, but there was no one there. Ben sat at his desk, absent-mindedly running his pen over his notebook. The classroom was steeped in dim light. Gray clouds outside had swallowed the sky, and the weak glow of the overhead lamps cast a heavy atmosphere over the room. Miss Gray, their biology teacher, paced between the rows, lecturing about the anatomy of mammals. Her voice sounded muffled, as if the classroom walls were swallowing all the sound. The structure of human musculature is very similar to that of some animals, particularly pork meat. Ben flinched. Pork meat? Why was she saying it like that? He glanced at Edward, sitting beside him. Edward sat upright, unblinking, listening intently. His lips moved slightly, as if whispering something under his breath. Therefore, if someone were to eat human flesh, they would notice that. A shiver ran down Ben's spine. Had he misheard? He snapped his head up and looked at Miss Gray. The woman stood at the board, making notes. Her movements were sharp, precise. For a second, Ben had the eerie feeling that she was watching him. Her thin lips curled into something resembling a smile, and her pupils, Ben could swear, dilated unnaturally wide. His gaze darted to the rest of the class. Everyone was sitting in silence. Everyone. Except for Sophie. Sophie Reeves, Edward's younger sister, sat directly in front of him. She was smiling. A thin, elaborate, unnatural smile. Ben caught a faint, almost imperceptible scent. Something metallic. Something sickly sweet. Blood. He wanted to look away, but at that moment, Sophie slowly, very slowly, licked her lips. Ben froze, feeling a chill crawl down his spine. Sophie kept staring at him. Her lips, still wet from where her tongue had passed over them, stretched into a wide, unsettling smile. He swallowed, trying to turn away, but he couldn't. Something in her gaze held him in place, as if icy fingers had wrapped around his throat. Everything around him went still. The rustling, the whispers, the sound of chalk against the board. All of it vanished. Only silence remained. And then he heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was far too close, as if someone had breathed the words right into his ear. You taste good. Ben shot up from his seat, shoving his chair back with a sharp scrape. The dull sound cut through the air. Everyone turned to look at him. Sophie's gaze never left him, but now her face was serene, as if nothing had happened. Ben? Miss Gray's voice was cold, indifferent. Is something wrong? He swallowed, licking his dry lips. I just thought I heard something. Miss Gray tilted her head, studying him. For too long, too intently. Then she smiled. Sit down, Ben. We still have a lot of interesting things ahead of us. Ben sat down, but the feeling of terror didn't fade. What was that voice? He replayed everything that had just happened in his mind. Sophie had been staring at him. She had licked her lips. And then he had heard that eerie hissing right inside his head. He knew it couldn't have been his imagination. Something was wrong with her. Are you okay? A voice came from his right. It was Edward. He leaned toward him slightly, his face wearing the frozen mask of a concerned friend. But something subtle in his expression made Ben tense up. Yeah, he mumbled, pretending to write something in his notebook. Edward held his gaze for a second, and then he smiled. Good, we're friends, right, Ben? Ben didn't answer, but at that moment, he felt a stare. Sophie was still watching him. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was just waiting. For what? Ben didn't know, but he had a distinct feeling that he was already caught. He tried to focus on the lesson, but the sensation of being watched never left him for a second. Sophie had stopped smiling, but her eyes never left him. He felt them on him even when he wasn't looking in her direction. Ben couldn't breathe freely. He was trapped. We're friends, right, Ben? Edward's words stuck in his mind like a jagged knife. What did he mean? It was a normal question. Or was it? Ben swallowed. He pretended to write in his notebook, but his pen trembled in his fingers. Sophie slowly leaned forward. Ben felt it. A chill ran down his spine. She didn't move abruptly. She just leaned in. But somehow, it was the most terrifying moment of his life. She opened her mouth as if she was about to say something, but then the bell rang. Ben flinched. Everyone started moving, gathering their things. Except Sophie. She sat there, her eyes still locked on him. Ben grabbed his backpack and rushed out of the classroom. He needed to leave. Immediately. Ophi stood by the window, staring at the gray schoolyard. She could feel him. His fear. Her lips still remembered the taste of his tense gaze, and a pleasant warmth slowly spread inside her. You overdid it. Edward's voice was cold. He sat on the windowsill, arms crossed over his chest, watching his sister with a barely noticeable hint of irritation. Sophie smiled, but there was no remorse in her expression. I didn't do anything terrible. Edward frowned. You broke him. Did you see how he trembled? You went too far. Sophie slowly turned her head toward her brother. Her eyes darkened. But you felt it, didn't you? She whispered. His scent changed. You noticed it, didn't you? Edward had noticed. Ben's scent had always been different. But today, something new had emerged within it. Fear. But not just fear. The fear of realization. He sensed that something was wrong with them. Sophie stepped closer and leaned toward her brother. He was always sweet. Not like the others. You knew that too. Edward didn't respond. Sophie continued. But now his taste has become unforgettable. He's afraid. He knows something is wrong with us, but he doesn't understand what exactly. She slowly licked her lips. Isn't that exciting? Edward abruptly stood up. You shouldn't have played with him. You could have ruined everything. Sophie laughed. Ruined? Oh, brother. She leaned closer and whispered directly into his ear. I made him taste better. Edward closed his eyes, clenching his teeth. She was right. Damn it, she was right. But something twisted inside him. Ben was just food, just a human. Then why did it feel like they were connected by something more? Why did everything inside him revolt when Sophie toyed with him? He didn't want Ben to be afraid. But now it was too late. Sophie and Edward walked down the dark road leading to their house. A light drizzle began to fall, raindrops hitting the pavement heavily, mixing with the scent of dampness and something else. Metallic. Blood. That scent never truly disappeared from this place. The Reeves family home stood slightly apart from the others. An old mansion with dark windows and peeling paint on the walls. But none of the neighbors ever complained. Sophie pushed the front door open, and it creaked long and slow. Inside, it was warm. The air smelled of meat, spices, and something else. Human fear. We're home, she called out, slamming the door behind her. A low voice echoed from the depths of the house. Perfect, kids. It's time for dinner. Victor Reeves sat in the living room, one leg crossed over the other. He held a newspaper in his hands, but Edward knew he wasn't reading it. He was listening. He was always listening. He could feel them. Sophie walked over and dropped lightly to her knees beside his chair, tilting her head like an obedient child. Dad, I want to talk about Ben. Victor froze. Edward tensed inwardly. What about him? Victor's voice was even, but there was a hidden threat within it. Two figures emerged from the depths of the house. Margaret and Lily, or as Edward and Sophie called them, Mom and Mom. Margaret blonde with a kind expression, wearing a flour-stained apron. Lily, dark-haired, her hair tied back in a ponytail, black gloves, cold eyes. They were both mothers, because Victor was a polygamist, because in this family the rules were different, because in this family morality didn't exist. Margaret smiled. Sweetheart, you look excited. What happened with Ben? Sophie bit her lip, her eyes gleaming. He's afraid of us. Margaret and Lily exchanged glances. Victor slowly put the newspaper aside. A deathly silence filled the room. And then he smiled. Then it's time to make a choice. Victor watched Sophie with interest, as if studying a new, thrilling experiment. There was satisfaction in his eyes. So, he's afraid of us? His voice was quiet, almost caring. Sophie shifted in place, her fingers absent-mindedly tugging at the hem of her school skirt. Yes, Dad. He's afraid. She almost savored the words. Margaret and Lily stood in silence, as if waiting for Victor's decision. Edward tensed. He knew what was coming next. Victor slowly rose from his chair. There was an unshakable grace in his movement. The grace of a predator preparing to strike the final blow. Well then, we need to decide what to do with him. Sophie froze. But he's mine. A cold shiver ran down Edward's spine. She said it as if Ben was her toy. Margaret chuckled softly. Sweetheart, he's human. You can't just claim him. But I want to. Sophie's voice wavered between anger and desperation. He's special. He's delicious. Victor stared at her, and for a brief moment, something harsh, something cold flickered in his gaze. You're getting too attached, Sophie. Ghouls don't bond with their food. Sophie clenched her jaw but said nothing. Edward could feel the air in the room grow heavy. Margaret and Lily exchanged glances. "If he's truly afraid, then he's a threat," Lily finally said. Cold, logical words. Sophie turned to her abruptly. "He's not a threat. She stopped herself. She didn't know how to explain it. Edward could see she was on the verge of snapping. But Victor had already made his decision. "Sophie, since you've grown so attached to him, you will bring him to us." Sophie blinked. "What?" Margaret stepped forward with a gentle smile, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair. "Sweetheart, if he already feels fear, sooner or later it will lead him to us. You don't want him to run, do you?" Sophie opened her mouth, then shut it. She was trapped. But something strange flickered in her eyes. Pleasure? Anticipation? "All right, Mom, I'll bring him." She smiled. But that smile promised nothing good. The next morning, Ben couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something had changed. The school looked the same as always. Students walked through the hallways, laughing, chatting. But he felt like he was at the center of an invisible attention. Every time he lifted his head, it seemed like someone was watching him. But when he turned around, there was no one there. He saw Edward and Sophie by the lockers. They were whispering to each other. They were planning something. Ben couldn't escape the feeling that he was part of that plan. When Edward noticed his gaze, he smiled, just like always. But that smile no longer felt friendly. Sophie, however, looked at him differently. There wasn't a trace of aggression in her eyes, only anticipation, as if she already knew what he was going to do. The lunch break. Ben sat at a table in the cafeteria trying to focus on the tray of food in front of him, but he had no appetite. Sophie sat down next to him. "Hey, Ben." Her voice was so soft, so warm, as if nothing had happened yesterday. He tensed. "Hey." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. "You seem tense today. Everything okay?" Ben felt his heart tighten. What was she doing? She looked at him like an ordinary friend, but he knew she was no ordinary friend. "Yeah, just didn't get enough sleep." Sophie tilted her head as if studying him. "Do you want to come over today?" Thunder out of a clear sky. Ben froze. "What?" Sophie smiled again. "Well, you've never been to our house, right? Let's have a movie night. Edward will be there too. It'll be fun." She didn't blink. Ben didn't know what to say. Every instinct screamed, "Don't do it." But he felt that if he refused, it would be even worse. "All right." Sophie licked her lips. "I'm so glad." She ran her fingers along his arm. For a brief moment, Ben felt cold, as if her skin was just a little colder than it should be. She leaned close to his ear. "You'll be my guest, Ben. My special guest." Late evening, the Reeves house. Sophie stepped into the living room. Margaret was already waiting for her. "Is he coming?" Sophie slowly nodded. "Yes, Mom." Lily emerged from the shadows, arms crossed over her chest. "Are you sure he won't suspect anything?" Sophie smiled. "He already feels fear, but he doesn't yet understand that we are hunters." Victor sat in his chair, absent-mindedly stroking the page of a newspaper. "Then tonight, we shall have a special feast." Edward said nothing, but something inside him wouldn't settle. Ben was walking straight into their hands, and he couldn't stop it. On the way, Ben walked down the sidewalk, pulling his sleeves down as the cold evening air bit into his skin. The sun had already begun to set, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at his insides. Sophie was waiting for him. Her voice still echoed in his head. "You'll be my special guest." Why did he agree? He didn't want to go, but his mouth had spoken that yes on its own. Ben slowed his steps. His heart pounded. Something was wrong. "Hey, kid!" A rough, slurred voice yanked him from his thoughts. He didn't have time to react before icy liquid splashed across his chest. Shit! He stumbled back, realizing his hoodie was now soaked and reeked of beer. In front of him stood a woman. Disheveled, greasy hair, wild eyes. A homeless woman he'd seen around before. She was staring at him, fingers gripping an empty bottle. "Don't go to them." Ben froze. "What?" The woman shook her head, as if trying to drive something out of her mind. You mustn't go there. They're not like you." A chill ran down his spine. "You? Who?" The woman jerked suddenly, grabbing his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Family. They're a family, but not yours." Ben yanked his arm free. "What are you even talking about?" But the woman had already turned and walked away, her silhouette vanishing into the darkness. Ben shuddered. He needed to change his clothes. This night was already ruined. But with every step toward the house, the truth became clearer. He didn't want to go there at all. He was being made to. How? They put it in his head. Newt. The name struck his memory like a hammer. Newt had gone missing a week ago. He had completely forgotten about him. But he was supposed to meet him. Flashback. "Listen, Ben." Newt's voice trembled, like he was about to say something important. "I need to talk to you." Ben frowned. "About what?" Newt glanced around. Without Edward. Present. But that meeting never happened. Ben stopped. Something lay in the grass, a backpack, black with a torn zipper. Ben recognized it instantly. Newt's backpack. And there was blood on it. Ben didn't move. Newt's backpack lay before him, bloody, forgotten. How did it get here? The town had long stopped talking about Newt. Everyone accepted his disappearance as something normal. But he was supposed to meet him. What did he want to talk about? They were friends. He knew something. Ben looked around. The darkness of the street felt deeper than usual. He leaned down, trembling fingers reaching for the backpack. It felt wet, heavy. Blood, or just rain. Home. A locked room. Ben turned on his desk lamp, his fingers shaking as he unzipped the backpack. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Metal. Rot. He pushed aside textbooks, sneakers, and found it. Newt's journal. Ben slowly opened it. The first page. Something's wrong with Edward. A chill ran through him. He flipped the page. "I see the way they look at people. They're not like us. I don't know exactly what it is, but I feel it." Ben's breathing turned shallow. He kept reading. I think they eat us." His heart clenched. The last entry. Written in large, frantic letters. "They know that I know. I see them in my dreams. They smell fear. If I disappear, don't trust them." The page was soaked in dark, dried blood. Ben dropped the journal. He wasn't breathing. Newt knew. And now he was gone. The next morning, Ben walked into the school, his knuckles white from gripping his backpack straps too tightly. Newt's journal was inside, buried between books. But it felt heavy. As if it wasn't just a diary. As if it was a scream from the grave. But something else happened today. And the whole town knew. Someone had been eaten. He heard it the moment he stepped into the school hall. "Did you hear?" Someone whispered by the lockers. "Yeah, they found her at 5 in the morning, but only..." Ben froze. Only half of her. Half. He stood completely still. They were talking about the woman, the one who spilled beer on him. They found her dead. No, not just dead. Eaten. "Don't go to them," And now, she would never go anywhere again. Ben swallowed hard, and then he realized something was wrong. Sophie and Edward, they weren't looking at him. He could feel them nearby, but they acted completely indifferent. Sophie laughed with her friends as if nothing had happened. Edward chatted with some guys, never sparing him a glance. But he felt it. He knew. They knew that he knew. And now, they were waiting. Waiting to see what he would do next. Ben woke up screaming, gasping for air as if he had just surfaced from freezing water. A nightmare. But it felt so real. He was there, in the Reeves house, but not just inside. In the dining room, a massive oak table. On it, bodies, ripped apart, mutilated, still warm, blood. It was everywhere. Puddles, splatters on the walls, dripping from the ceiling. It soaked into the wooden floor, seeping through the cracks. The smell, sweet, sickly. It curdled his stomach. And in the middle of it all, she stood. Sophie, her dress drenched in blood, her hair a tangled mess, and her eyes glowing with madness. She was laughing, hysterical, shaky, like someone who had lost all grip on reality. Ben couldn't move. He was frozen, like an animal before slaughter. Sophie leaned closer. Her lips trembled with excitement, her face slick with someone else's blood. She grabbed his hands, too tightly. Her nails dug into his skin. She breathed against his face. Rot, decay, the stench of dead flesh. Her voice was hoarse and devilishly happy. "Eat me, Ben," she laughed, louder, a laugh that was no longer a laugh. The screams of the dead trapped in this house. The screams of those who had screamed before they were eaten. The laughter turned into a scream, and Ben screamed with her and woke up, drenched in cold sweat. His heart hammered inside his chest. But he was alone. The room was silent, but he could still hear that laughter. He couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. The past few days, Ben had felt strangely calm. No, the fear hadn't disappeared. It had just changed. He was no longer afraid of the Reeves, because now his fear lived inside him, in his dreams. Every night, the nightmares tore through his mind, leaving him waking up in cold sweat. But the days were normal. Edward had gone back to how he used to be. They talked again, laughed, pretended like everything was as it had been. Sophie. She no longer looked at him. She didn't try to touch him, seduce him, whisper to him in the dark. She just forgot about him, like a broken toy. That suited Ben just fine. The Reeves believed he was ordinary again, that he had figured out nothing. They had relaxed, but he hadn't, because now he knew, and that fact would never go away. But the nights, they belonged to fear, and his mind would not let him rest. The dreams were getting worse, more real, more alive. Sometimes he couldn't even tell where the dream ended and the morning began. He could hear Sophie, see her standing before him, feel her fingers on his skin. But the moment he blinked, he was in his bed. She was never really here. Right? Right? The Reeves house. Evening. Margaret and Lily sat at the table. Edward ate with a smile. Sophie flipped through a magazine. Victor sipped his tea, head tilted in thought. He was always sensing, always checking. But now everything was fine. Ben was just an ordinary boy again. They no longer saw him as a threat. Sophie even shrugged when someone mentioned him. "I'm not interested anymore." She said it as if talking about an old dress that had gone out of fashion. Edward stayed silent, but something remained inside him. Something he could not explain. Something that squeezed at his insides. But like the rest, he pretended he felt nothing. Because if he felt it, Victor would know, and Victor did not tolerate weakness. And weakness smelled like fear, and fear led to hunger. And the Reeves family had been full for a long time. The Reeves house. Evening. Margaret and Lily sat at the table. Edward ate with a smile. Sophie flipped through a magazine. Victor sipped his tea, head tilted in thought. He was always sensing, always checking. But now everything was fine. Ben was just an ordinary boy again. They no longer saw him as a threat. Sophie even shrugged when someone mentioned him. "I'm not interested anymore." She said it as if talking about an old dress that had gone out of fashion. Edward stayed silent, but something remained inside him. Something he could not explain. Something that squeezed at his insides. But like the rest, he pretended he felt nothing. Because if he felt it, Victor would know. And Victor did not tolerate weakness. And weakness smelled like fear. And fear led to hunger. And the Reeves family had been full for a long time. At first glance, everything was normal. But Ben never stopped watching them. He pretended everything was the same. That the nightmares were just tricks of his mind. That Edward's family was just strange. Nothing more. But the truth had already taken root inside him, and there was no getting rid of it. So he started watching them. After school, when the Reeves thought they were alone, Ben was there. He searched for proof. He needed to know what happened to Newt. And then, one night, he saw. Ben crouched behind the bushes near the bus stop. Night had settled in, and the streets were emptying. Then, he saw Edward. But not the Edward he knew. Not the Edward who joked, did homework, and walked with him between classes. This was the real Edward. Edward stalked through a dark alleyway, moving like a predator who had just sensed his prey. His body looked relaxed, but it carried the tightness of a coiled spring before the snap. Ahead of him walked a man, just a regular passerby. He had no idea he was being hunted. Edward picked up speed, and in the next second, he struck. Ben wanted to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. Edward moved fast, silent, like this was something normal. A lunge, a grip like steel, a flash of fangs. The man never even got to scream, just a wet, gurgling sound as his throat was ripped open. Ben clamped his hand over his mouth, so he wouldn't make a sound. But he couldn't look away. Edward slowly lifted his head, his face drenched in blood. But the most horrifying part, his eyes. They glowed with hunger, pure, endless. Hunger. A hunger that would never be satisfied. He enjoyed this. He had always enjoyed this. And now, Ben knew. Ben knew this was madness. But he couldn't stop. Every night when the Reeves left their house, he followed them. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Evidence? Confirmation? Or maybe something inside him just wanted to see the truth to the very end. Tonight he got his answer. An abandoned construction site. Half-ruined walls. Ben hid behind a pile of concrete blocks, trying not to breathe too loudly. Right in front of him, standing in the middle of the empty space, was Edward. But he wasn't alone. At his feet, a figure writhed. A man. He was still alive. He tried to speak, but blood filled his throat. Edward watched him, like a cat, playing with its food. And then he smiled. And then he started eating. Ben filmed it. The camera in his phone shook, but he kept recording. Every bite, every snap of bone, every drop of blood that dripped from Edward's lips. He had proof now. Now he could do something. But he didn't notice the most important thing. Sophie. She was somewhere nearby, and she had sensed him. The scent. A scent she knew better than anything. A scent she loved most of all. The scent of fear. Her eyes widened. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Ben." Ben felt his heart clench. A cold, paralyzing horror ran down his spine. He heard her voice, soft, almost gentle, but he knew it was a deadly call. She could feel him. Sophie knew he was here. She was breathing in his fear, and she wanted to find him. Ben swallowed his panic. Only one thing mattered now: run. But if he ran, they would hear him. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew that if they found him, he wouldn't live until morning. He stepped back, slowly, moving deeper into the shadows, trying not to make a sound. Behind him, a soft rustling noise. They had started looking. Sophie spoke quietly, almost purring, like a cat cornering its prey. "Ben, where are you? I can feel you." Ben froze, pressing a hand over his mouth to silence his breathing. She was too close, too close. He had to escape, now, or this would be his end. Ben knew, if he made even one wrong move, it was over. His lungs burned, but he couldn't breathe too loudly. His body screamed to move, but he couldn't afford even the smallest sound. Sophie was too close. Her voice was soft, almost caring. "Ben, you're not scared of me, are you?" The dark construction site had become a deadly maze. Every corner was a trap. He saw Sophie's shadow. She moved slowly, lazily, but he knew it was a trick. At any moment, she could pounce. Cold sweat ran down his spine. He had to get out. But he couldn't run. They would hear. He couldn't stay. They would find him. He had to disappear. Vanish into the night. Sophie inhaled deeply. He was here. Edward emerged from the other side of the site, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "Are you sure?" Sophie took another deep breath, slowly savoring the air. She crouched down, her fingers tracing the concrete. Then she rose to her feet. Yes, he was here. Ben stood in the shadows, not moving. Just a few more steps. If he could just reach the fence, he could escape. But he couldn't move while they were so close. Just a little longer, a little longer. Edward frowned. If he was here, where did he go? Sophie ran her tongue over her teeth. And then, she smiled. He's hiding, but he hasn't gone far. He's afraid of us. Her smile widened. He'll be back. Ben took one final step back and vanished into the night. He survived. But they knew he had been there. And now, he was on their list. Ben sat at the edge of his bed, clutching his phone in his hand. He knew he had recorded it. He had seen Edward eating a man. He had seen blood dripping down his chin, had seen him smiling in the darkness. He had filmed it all, but he was too afraid to watch it again. If he saw it one more time, if his eyes met that horrifying scene again, he wouldn't be able to handle it. The proof was there. That was all that mattered. Now, he could do something. All he had to do was make it to morning and go to the police. But the night was long. He lay in bed, listening to the silence. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the image was there. The smell of blood, the sound of flesh tearing, the crunch of bones, Sophie's laughter, that soft, muffled laughter as she had been hunting him. He's here. I can feel him. He didn't fall asleep until morning. When Ben woke up, he knew what he had to do. He would get up, grab his phone, and go to the police. Not to school, to the police. But when he opened his gallery, the video was gone. His breath hitched. He scrolled through his files again and again, but it was missing, as if it had never existed, as if it had only been a dream. No, it was here. He checked the folders, the cache, the backups. Nothing. Empty. His hands began to shake. His throat tightened. Maybe he was losing his mind? Maybe he had just imagined it? Maybe none of it was real? Maybe he was breaking. He didn't notice when his mother walked into the room. "Ben, you're not ready yet?" He slowly looked up. His lips were dry. I don't feel well." Her gaze hardened. "Ben, you don't have a fever. You're fine. Get dressed and go to school." "But Mom..." "Ben, no arguments." He realized he had lost. He had to go. He had to return to the place where they were waiting for him. Ben walked through the school hallway, lost in his thoughts. He had started to believe that all of this had been just a nightmare, that his mind had played a cruel trick on him, that the Reeves were just strange people, not monsters, that he had made it all up. Yes, it was just a dream, a horrible, realistic dream, and he had let it get to him. Because if it were real, the video would still be there, but it wasn't. So that meant nothing had happened, right? Right? He tried to convince himself, because if he didn't, he would lose his mind. Edward was acting normal again, joking, teasing classmates. He was just Edward. And Ben felt like an idiot. He even started laughing with them, joking around, pretending nothing had happened. As if he'd just returned to normal, as if everything was fine. Until the bell rang, and then he heard it. A muffled conversation. "Did you hear? Someone went missing again." "Yeah, but this time, they found him." "Who?" "Phil." Phil. The name hit him like a hammer. Phil. That was the name of the man Edward was eating last night. But that was just a dream, right? Right? The blood drained from his face. His heart clenched into a knot. He slowly turned, listening intently. They say he was torn apart by wolves. Wolves, of course. It was always the wolves, only it wasn't wolves. Ben couldn't breathe. Reality crashed down on him. He wasn't crazy. He hadn't imagined it. He had seen the truth. And now, he knew for certain. Edward had killed Phil. And now Ben was trapped among monsters. And they knew. That he knew. Ben felt sick. His hands were trembling as he shut his locker. Phil was real. His death was real. And that meant everything else was real too. Edward ate him. And Sophie had hunted Ben in the dark. Now he knew. The truth was far worse than any nightmare. And that was the moment she approached him. Sophie. Her presence felt wrong. She didn't say a word, just stood there, too close. Ben caught the faint scent of her perfume mixed with something warm, animalistic, rotten. His body tensed, but he couldn't move, as if it no longer belonged to him. Sophie placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Software almost tender. "You're so tense, Ben," she whispered. Her voice was melodic, velvety, and it slipped into his mind like water through his fingers. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Her nails pressed into his skin. Her lips parted in a slow, easy smile. To everyone around them, it was just a pretty girl flirting with a boy. No one saw how his mind sank, how his will melted, how his eyes turned distant, glazed. "You want to invite me over, don't you, Ben?" Her voice was honey, sweet, sticky, dangerous. "Yes," he exhaled. He didn't want to say it, but the words escaped before he could stop them. Sophie smiled in satisfaction. "Really? How sweet." She tilted her head slightly, her fingers gliding down his arm. "Tonight, we could study, and then have dinner." She looked straight into his eyes. That was not the gaze of a girl. It was the gaze of a predator. Yes. Ben couldn't control himself. "Yes. Tonight. Come over." "Oh, I definitely will, Ben." She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. "You've already called your mom, haven't you? Told her to make something special?" He didn't even blink. Yes. At that moment, someone nearby snickered. "Sophie, you flirt too hard." One of their classmates laughed. "Did you see his face?" Another girl giggled. "Ben, are you blushing?" Ben didn't answer. He couldn't. He was trapped. Sophie ran her finger along his cheek. "See you tonight, Ben. I hope dinner will be special." And then she walked away. Only then did he finally breathe again. But it was too late. He had invited her in. He had told his mother to make something special. He had opened the door to a monster. He was doomed. Ben ran out of his last class. He knew it wouldn't change anything, but at least he could try to create the illusion of choice. He wanted to get home first, wanted to come up with something, any trick, any chance to survive. But the moment he stepped through the school gates, she was already waiting. Sophie. She stood beneath a street lamp, her head tilted slightly, a soft smile on her lips. Almost sympathetic. As if she already knew he would try to run. As if she already knew he wouldn't succeed. Ben didn't flinch, didn't slow down. He kept walking, forcing his muscles to relax. Because he knew one thing. If he tried to run, he would sign his own death warrant. Sophie wouldn't let him leave. But this way, maybe. Maybe he could still come up with something. He smiled at her, a little strained, but natural enough. "Waiting for me?" She blinked, as if surprised by his behavior. Her eyes ran over him, assessing. She thought she'd have to use hypnosis again, but he wasn't resisting. "Interesting." "Of course," she said softly. "You invited me, remember? I was sure you wouldn't forget." Ben held out his hand. Sophie's brows lifted slightly. But then, her lips curled into a pleased smile, and she placed her hand into his. And so, they walked home. Almost naturally, almost like an ordinary couple, to her final meal. Sophie glanced at him with curiosity. Her voice was melodic, almost warm. "I've always liked you, Ben." He didn't answer. "You're special." He forced himself to smirk. "Oh, really? And why's that?" She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "You're different." She paused, searching for the right words. Her lips trembled slightly with pleasure. She remembered how she had slipped into his room last night, how she had stood by his bed, watching him, how her fingers had brushed against his phone, deleting the video that could have changed his life, how she could have killed him right then, while he slept. But she didn't, because she had other plans. Not to kill him, but to dine with him, with his mother. Sophie smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Dinner will be unforgettable, Ben. I'm sure of it." He didn't answer. He only kept walking and tried to think of a way not to die tonight. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sophie stepped inside, like a cat. Unhurried, graceful, as if every move had been calculated in advance. Ben felt it. The air grew heavier. His own home was no longer his, but he couldn't let it show. He couldn't let her know that he knew. So he pretended everything was fine, as if they really had just come over to study. He pulled out a textbook, flipped it open to a random page without even glancing at the subject. But Sophie looked, and a shadow of a smile touched her lips. Oh, biology. How fitting. Ben blinked. He had thought they'd study math or history, but numbers and dates didn't interest Sophie. She was drawn to something more alive. She turned the page, her fingers gliding lightly over the paper. The human body is a fascinating thing, isn't it? Ben swallowed hard. On the page before them was the image of a flayed human body, muscles, bones, and organs exposed in vivid detail. He didn't look at her, but he felt her gaze. Sophie leaned in slightly. "Studying is boring without practice, don't you think?" Her voice was soft, but there was something beneath it, something deeper. And before Ben could fully process what was happening, she took his hand. Her skin was cold, but not in a way that a person's skin should be. This cold was wrong. And then, she pressed his palm against her bare chest. Ben froze. His mind screamed, but his body refused to move. Smooth, warm skin under his fingertips, but something about it felt foreign, unnatural. Sophie smiled. "And this is the chest." She looked him directly in the eyes. Her breath was steady, calm, as if this meant nothing to her, as if this was just science, as if she wasn't studying his reaction, but the very process itself. But her pupils dilated slightly. She was enjoying this moment, not because he excited her, but because she could see what this was doing to him. She saw how it unraveled him, how he couldn't look away, how he couldn't move, how he was drowning in his own vulnerability. She squeezed his fingers gently. "See? Practice is always better than theory." Her voice was almost a whisper. Ben's heart pounded too fast. This wasn't arousal. It was fear, because he understood. He was trapped, and she knew it. Slowly, she let go of his hand, but something between them had already changed. Ben knew he had crossed a line he never wanted to cross. He was playing her game, and he couldn't stop. And then, his mother's voice called out, "Kids, that's enough studying. Sophie, sweetheart, come help me set the table." Sophie blinked slowly, and suddenly, she was sweet again. Ordinary, that perfect girl she always pretended to be. "Of course, Mrs. Watson," she responded cheerfully. "I'd love to." She stood up and walked toward the kitchen, but just before leaving the room, she turned back, and for a split second, her smile vanished. She looked at him as if she knew this was only the prelude, and that the real fun would begin at dinner. Ben sat at the edge of his bed, unable to move. His hand still burned from Sophie's touch. He could feel her skin, her breath, her voice. He had given in. She had broken him in mere seconds. And it wasn't hypnosis. It was something else. Something deeper, something ancient, something primal. His thoughts spiraled, drowning in the realization, until a single word exploded in his mind. Ghouls. The word hit his consciousness like thunder. Not humans, not just predators. They were ghouls. Monsters, hidden beneath human skin. Creatures that toyed with you like a cat with a mouse until they decided it was time. And he had given in. He hadn't fought back. He let her act as if it was normal. Because he was vulnerable. Because he was a man. She knew how to break him. And she did it effortlessly. Like he was nothing but a trophy, a plaything to be toyed with, then discarded. Ben shuddered, snapped back to reality, checked the time. 15 minutes. 15 damn minutes. He had just been sitting there, lost in his thoughts, while she was downstairs, alone, with the monster. Sophie had been with her for far too long, and Ben had no idea how far things had gone. He jumped to his feet, his heart pounding violently. If he hesitated any longer, he might already be too late. He had to get downstairs, right now. Before Sophie started her dinner, Ben jumped off the bed. He didn't think. He couldn't think. He just ran, down the stairs, through the hallway. Each step echoed in his mind like nails being hammered into a coffin. He heard her voice before he saw her. Hurry up, Ben. Sophie's voice was cheerful, almost sing-song. You're just in time. Cold washed over him. He rushed into the kitchen, and the world collapsed. The table was set for dinner. Warm lamplight, the scent of roasted meat, glasses filled with wine. And his mother. She was sitting at the table, but she wasn't moving. Her eyes were wide open. She was alive, but she couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't fight back. Paralyzed. Her chest rose and fell in quick, panicked breaths. And then Ben saw her face. Her cheek. It was gone. Only a gaping, bloody wound remained, exposing teeth, raw muscle, and blood. It dripped from her chin, down her neck, onto her dress. But Sophie wasn't even looking at that. She was holding something else. His mother's left hand, torn clean from her shoulder, tendons and veins ripped apart in jagged, uneven strands. She held it over her plate like it was a turkey leg. Her teeth sank into the flesh, savoring each bite. And as she ate, she smiled, warm, friendly, as if this wasn't a slaughter, but a family dinner. Her eyes gleamed. "Take a seat, Ben," she purred, licking her lips. Dinner turned out beautifully. He couldn't breathe. The world was caving in. The sound of dripping blood, the sticky scent of cooked flesh. This was the end. He couldn't save her. She was already being eaten. Ben couldn't breathe. He felt his stomach twist into a tight knot, his mouth dry, his legs weak and unsteady. But he couldn't fall, couldn't close his eyes. He had to watch. Watch as his mother, still alive, sat motionless, unable to move, her eyes filled with agony and terror. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. Her skin was growing paler. Blood dripped from the edge of the table, pooling onto the floor. Watch as Sophie held her hand, as her teeth crunched through bone, as she slowly chewed, savoring the taste, as if this really was just dinner. "What's wrong, Ben?" Her voice was warm, almost gentle. "Not hungry?" He couldn't answer, couldn't say a word. Sophie watched him, eyes slightly narrowed. She was enjoying this moment, enjoying his fear, his weakness, his helplessness. She picked up a fork, casually stabbing the piece of meat on her plate. "I even saved you the best part." She lifted the fork, holding a bloody chunk of flesh. "Try it." She brought it to his lips. Ben gasped for air. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But he couldn't. Because Sophie was watching him. Because he knew that if he refused, she would tear him apart right here, right on this table. He swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the fork. But his mother. His mother. She was still alive. She could hear everything. She could understand everything. She couldn't speak. But her eyes, they begged him, "Don't do this." Sophie watched him, a quiet thrill in her expression. "Come on, Ben. You don't want to disappoint me, do you?" Her smile widened. "Eat." Ben clenched his fists. His world was collapsing, but he had to make a choice. If he didn't play along, he would die. If he did, he would betray his mother. But if he chose the first option, she would die anyway. His choice was an illusion. He was trapped in hell, and there was no way out. Ben pretended to surrender. He took the fork, raised the bloody piece to his lips, but at the last moment, he jerked his hand sharply and threw the fork straight at Sophie's face. The metal flashed in the air, but Sophie didn't even blink. Her hair came to life, snapping like a serpent, coiling around her neck and knocking the fork away before it could touch her skin. Ben sprang to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. He lunged for his mother, but he wasn't fast enough. Something grabbed him. Hair, long, thin, moving like living threads. They wrapped around his wrists, his legs, his throat. He thrashed, struggling to break free, but they were stronger than steel. Sophie rose slowly from the table, smirking. Her eyes glowed. Ben, Ben. Her voice was soft, almost tender. You know I like it when you fight back. She leaned in. Her lips brushed his ear. But I like it even more when you can't do anything. The hair yanked him down, forcing him onto his knees, right in front of his mother, still alive. Her eyes filled with horror, pain, a silent scream. And then, Sophie tore open her stomach with her bare hands. Her fingers pierced the flesh, sank inside. Blood splattered, a scorching, ripping agony. But the scream, it only existed inside Ben's head because his mother couldn't scream. She was paralyzed. She could only feel. Sophie pushed her hand deeper, deeper. She pulled something out, red, pulsing, intestines. She looked at them with pure admiration. Warm, soft. She brought them to her lips and began to eat, right in front of Ben. She took her time, chewed slowly. Her eyes fluttered shut in pleasure, savoring every moment. Blood dripped down her chin, down her neck. She sighed contentedly. You wanted dinner, didn't you, Ben? She ran her tongue across her lips. The food still warm, Ben screamed. He thrashed with all his strength, but the hair held him tight. Sophie leaned in closer. Her breath burned against his skin. I like you, Ben, she whispered. But I like you even more when you're helpless. Her hand plunged back into his mother's stomach, even deeper. She pulled out something else, her liver. Sophie took a bite. She chewed thoughtfully, pretended to evaluate the taste. A bit of iron, but overall, she smiled. Delicious. His mother's eyes began to dim. She was dying, and Ben couldn't do anything. Sophie turned back to him. Don't be afraid, Ben. I won't eat you right away. Her smile widened. I want you to feel it. She ran a finger down his cheek. Her voice was a whisper. We're family now. And in a family, we always share our food. She lifted a piece of flesh to his face. Go on. Eat. Ben was drowning in horror, but beneath the fear, something else was rising. Rage, burning, boiling. It pounded inside his chest, squeezing his ribs, choking his breath. Sophie. She sat in front of him, savoring the kill. Her fingers were drenched in his mother's blood. She did it slowly, relishing every second. Because she wasn't just enjoying the meat. She was enjoying his pain, his helplessness. And that he would never forgive. Not ever. Ben took a deep breath, exhaling through his nose. He knew he had no chance. He was bound by her hair. He was trapped. He was probably already dead. But if this was his last night, he wouldn't go quietly. He'd make her pay. He wouldn't die without leaving scars on this monster. Sophie watched him, her predatory smile widening. You're so angry, Ben. Her voice was soft, almost comforting. That's normal. That's so human. She ran a bloody finger across his lips, leaving a warm, wet streak. But you do understand. That anger won't save you. She licked her finger. You're helpless. And that's when Ben understood. Sophie was sure she controlled him. She was sure he was no longer a threat. She thought he was broken, but she was wrong. Ben lunged forward and sank his teeth into her wrist. Her eyes widened. Not in fear, in shock, in pain. His teeth clenched down with a fury he didn't even know he was capable of. Bitter blood flooded his mouth, scorching his tongue with something metallic, something inhuman. Sophie shrieked, not in fear, in rage. Her hair tightened around his throat, his wrists, his ribs. But he was ready. Pain didn't matter anymore. He spat her blood out and roared, surging forward. The chair beneath him splintered. Her hair loosened for just a second. And that was all he needed. Ben wrenched free, slamming into Sophie, knocking her backward. She stumbled, crashing into the table, spilling wine glasses onto the floor. He had a moment, just one, and he wasn't going to waste it. His hand snatched the first thing within reach. A kitchen knife lying near the cutting board, and he swung it. The first strike, the first of many. Sophie pressed the bloody piece of flesh to her lips, her gaze locked onto Ben. She was waiting. She wanted him to break, to submit. But Ben wasn't ready to die. He couldn't save his mother, but he could get revenge. He could start with her. His hand shot into his pocket, fingers closing around the lighter. He flicked the wheel. A flame sparked to life. Sophie frowned. She didn't understand. Not until Ben lunged forward and pressed the fire to her hair. The heat exploded. Fire engulfed her instantly, flames racing through her long strands like a fuse on dynamite. Sophie roared. She staggered back, grabbing at her head, but that only fanned the flames. Thick, rancid smoke filled the kitchen. Ben didn't waste time. He lunged for the cabinet beneath the sink and yanked out the heavy fire axe. His father kept it there, just in case. Well, this was the case. Sophie was already recovering. Her burning hair crumbled into ash, but she was still standing. Her eyes found him, and they were raging. She snarled and lunged at him, but Ben had already raised the axe. Crack! The blade cleaved through fabric, through skin, through muscle. Sophie collapsed to one knee, but she wasn't dead. Ghouls don't die from one hit. She lifted her head, and her hair, despite the burns, began to slither again, like snakes reaching for him. Ben lifted the axe and swung it down again, straight into her skull. Thunk! The blade sank deep. Sophie twitched. Her hands jerked violently, her pupils dilated. She took one step forward, another, and then she froze. Her body crumpled to the floor with a dull, lifeless thud. She didn't move again. Ben breathed heavily. His whole body trembled. He killed her. He killed her. But he didn't let himself relax, because now her family would know, and they would come. But now he was ready. Now he wasn't prey. Now he was the hunter. And he wouldn't stop. Silence. Only his heavy breathing, the smell of blood, and Sophie's motionless body on the floor. Ben stood there, gripping the axe, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He needed to think. Fast. Her family would come. He had to hide the body, clean the evidence. But before he could move, ding-dong. The doorbell pierced the air. Ben flinched. Ding-dong, ding-dong. The ringing grew more insistent. And then, a loud, authoritative knock. Open up! Police. The voice was firm, demanding. Ben froze. The police? Who called them? Not him. He hadn't called anyone. His mother, she couldn't have. Then who? The knock came again. Ben Watson opened the door immediately. His head spun. If he didn't open, it would be worse. They would break in. He stepped toward the door, placing a hand on the handle. A deep breath, a slow exhale. He opened it. A tall man in a police uniform stood at the threshold. Blonde hair, sharp features, piercing gaze. His badge gleamed under the porch light. Ben Watson? Ben nodded. The officer scanned him, eyes flicking over his face. You home alone, son? Ben swallowed. Yeah. We got an anonymous call. Neighbors reported screams, said something strange was going on. Anonymous call? Something was wrong. A chill crept down his spine, but he couldn't show it. Yeah, he forced a smile. Just Watching a horror movie. The officer frowned. Can I come in? Ben tensed, but he couldn't refuse. Yeah, sure. He stepped aside, letting the officer in. The man walked slowly, glancing around. Ben closed the door, trying to keep his breathing even. You sure you're alone? Yeah. Where's your mother? His stomach clenched. He dropped his gaze. She went out. The officer's eyes didn't leave him. Went out? At this hour? Yeah. Where? I don't know. The officer nodded slowly. Mind if I take a look around? Ben's throat went dry. He couldn't let him into the kitchen. The body was there, but he couldn't refuse. That would be suspicious. Of course, he croaked. But it's messy. That's my job, the officer said coldly. He walked further in, his movements deliberate. Something was off. He wasn't acting like a normal cop. And then, the officer stopped, turned his head, stared at Ben. You're nervous. No. I can see that you are. Ben clenched his fists. Just tired. The officer nodded. But then, his eyes changed. They darkened, as if something inside them moved. And then, he smiled. On fire. A wide, unnatural smile. Ben, do you believe in ghosts? A chill tore down his spine. Ben staggered back. What? Ghosts, the officer repeated. Don't you think they walk these halls? Ben's blood turned to ice. He felt it. No, he knew. This wasn't a cop. This was Edward. It was Edward. Realization struck like a lightning bolt. The moment Ben understood, the officer's face began to warp, lips twisting into a monstrous grin, eyes sinking into pools of blackness. His features blurred, and within seconds, the illusion shattered. Edward stood before him. The real Edward, the one Ben had grown up with, the one he had called his best friend. But now, he was a monster. Edward licked his lips. You figured it out, Ben. Yes, me. He stepped closer. And now you die. Ben didn't let him finish. He lunged for the bear trap waiting just behind the door. Edward leaped at him. Ben threw himself backward, kicking the mechanism. Clang! A scream. The steel jaws snapped around Edward's leg. Crunch. Bone shattered. Blood splattered across the floor. Edward roared. He thrashed, trying to tear free, but the trap held firm. He was caught. Ben stood there, panting, gripping the knife in his hand. He wasn't prey anymore. He was the hunter. And Edward was next. Edward roared in pain. The bear trap held his leg tight, torn flesh gaping beneath the metal teeth. He tried to yank free, but every struggle only worsened the wound, sending blood gushing even faster. Ben watched as his muscles trembled from strain. Edward was strong, but he was trapped, and Ben wasn't going to waste this chance. He gripped the knife tighter and stepped closer. You made a mistake, he said. Edward gritted his teeth. A mistake? He laughed, though his voice wavered from pain. No, Ben. The only mistake here is you. His eyes flashed, and suddenly, his hand snapped forward from behind his back. Ben didn't have time to react. A razor blade flashed in the air. Sharp pain tore through his shoulder. The blade sliced through skin, through fabric. Blood splattered. Ben staggered back, instinctively clutching the wound. Edward snarled and swung the razor again, but Ben dodged just in time, stepping to the side. Hatred burned in the ghoul's eyes. You think you're going to kill me? I don't think. Ben raised the knife. I know. Edward roared, lunging forward. But the bear trap held him in place. He thrashed like a wild animal, but the metal only dug deeper into his flesh, ripping his muscles apart. He couldn't run, but that didn't mean he couldn't fight. His teeth suddenly elongated, exposing razor-sharp fangs. His lips curled into a snarl. "You smell delicious, Ben." Ben tightened his grip on the knife. "You're just meat." Edward laughed. "Am I?" And then, he did something Ben didn't expect. He lunged forward. Flesh tore, bones snapped. The trap shredded his leg down to the bone. But he didn't stop. He crashed into Ben and they collapsed onto the floor. The razor flashed again. Ben barely dodged. A strand of his hair sliced clean off. He kicked Edward in the gut, sending him staggering back. But the ghoul only grew angrier. "I'm still going to eat you, Ben." He lunged again, but Ben drove the knife into his shoulder. Edward howled, but didn't stop. He swung a fist. The impact sent Ben flying into the wall. His wounded shoulder burned. Edward was injured, but still dangerous. And Ben knew, if he didn't finish him now, he wouldn't get another chance. He frantically looked around. He needed something stronger than a knife, something that would end this for good. And then, his eyes landed on the fireplace mantel. His father's old shotgun, loaded. He darted for it. But Edward was faster. His claws raked across Ben's back, shredding fabric, sinking into flesh. Pain exploded through him. Ben screamed and slammed an elbow into Edward's gut. Edward staggered. It was enough. Ben ripped the shotgun off the mantel, spun around, aimed straight at Edward's head, and pulled the trigger. Boom! Dark blood sprayed across the wall. Edward collapsed backward. His head burst open like overripe fruit. Another body, but not the last. Ben wiped blood from his face. Now the hunter was him. Ben wasn't going to wait. If he stayed in the house, they would find him sooner or later. But if he went after them first, he could end this. Forever. He armed himself with everything he could find. Shotgun, hunting knife, a few bottles of acid he found in the storage room, salt. He left Edward's head where it had fallen. Let Victor see for himself what he had done. Dark streets concealed him as he moved toward the Reeves house. The massive mansion loomed at the end of the street, towering over the neighboring homes. Silent. Ominous. But evil lurked within. Ben froze in the shadows, watching, just in time. A black car pulled into the driveway. Victor was behind the wheel. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. He was leaving, probably heading to Ben's house. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he was going to see Edward's corpse. But that meant one thing. Margaret and Lily were still inside. And without Victor, they had no leader. This was his chance. Ben took a deep breath. It was time to hunt. He crept along the fence, staying in the shadows. No sounds from inside, no movement behind the windows. But he knew they were there. The house was too quiet, as if it was waiting for him. He found the back door, locked, but the glass beside the handle shattered easily under the butt of the shotgun. He slowly pushed it open, stepping inside. Darkness swallowed him. The smell. Rot. Fire. Something else. The air was thick, sticky, as if he had stepped into something alive. He moved carefully, barely breathing. The living room. Spotless. Too perfect. But Ben knew it was a lie. People had been killed here. Many people. Then he saw the staircase leading up. His heart pounded. They were up there. He climbed. Each step echoed in his skull. He stopped in front of the first door, Lily's room. His hand reached for the doorknob. And then, The light switched on by itself. Ben froze. Then he heard the voice. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" Lily. Her voice came from everywhere. But she was right in front of him, standing by the window, long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, lips stretched into a smile. But something was wrong. The mirror beside her. It showed something else. In the mirror, Lily wasn't standing by the window. In the mirror, she was right in front of him, with her hands reaching out, with black, bottomless eyes. Ben blinked, and the room changed. He wasn't in the Reeves house anymore. He was in school, in an empty classroom, and his mother was sitting in front of him, alive, whole. "Ben, what have you done?" Her voice was so soft, so familiar. "You killed them, son." No, you became a monster." Her eyes darkened, her mouth twisted into a horrific grin. "Just like us." Ben clutched his head. Number. This isn't real. He knew this wasn't real. But his mind was unraveling, wrapped in fear. He could see his mother. He could smell her. He could hear her voice. But it wasn't her. It was Lily. Her illusions were breaking his mind, trapping him. If he didn't get out now, he never would. He looked around desperately. The mirror. It showed reality. He lunged at the mirror and smashed it with the shotgun stock. Glass exploded into shards. The room changed again. No more school, no more mother. Only Lily, the real one. And now her face twisted with fury. "You?" Ben raised the shotgun and fired. The blast shook the house. Lily was thrown backward, crashing onto the floor. A gaping hole in her chest oozed black blood. She gasped, her eyes glassy, unfocused. Ben slowly approached. He watched as she twitched, trying to rise. But she would never get up again. "No more illusions," he said quietly. He lifted his foot and stomped down on her head with the shotgun stock. Crunch. Only Margaret remained. And Victor. But now he knew for sure. He would kill them all, every last one of them. Lily's blood still dripped from the shotgun stock as Ben stepped into the hallway. The house felt different now. Without her illusions, he could sense its true nature. Rot. The stench of damp decay. The old blood soaked into the walls. He could hear it. The house was breathing. As if it knew its masters were dying, one by one. Only Margaret remained. Ben moved forward. He knew where to find her. Her bedroom was at the end of the hallway, behind a massive carved wooden door. The mistress of the house. He stood before the door, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. Unlocked. That was strange. But he had no doubts. Margaret was waiting for him, and he wasn't going to hesitate. The door swung wide. The room was bathed in shadows. The curtains were drawn shut. Only the dim glow of a night lamp pushed back the darkness. A grand four-poster bed. A heavy wooden table, lined with glass bottles, jars, and bundles of herbs. And Margaret herself, sitting at her vanity, slowly brushing her long silver hair. In the mirror's reflection, her eyes gleamed as she saw him. "You killed my daughter," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost tender. Ben raised the shotgun. "Yes." She didn't turn to face him. The comb still glided through her hair. "Do you understand what you've done, Ben?" "Yes," he repeated. This time he wasn't going to talk. He pulled the trigger. Boom. The mirror shattered. The table overturned. But Margaret was fast. Unrealistically fast. She vanished the moment the bullet should have torn through her. And then he felt her behind him. A soft breath at the nape of his neck. cold fingers tightening around his throat. "I can feel your rage, boy," she whispered. He spun around, swinging the shotgun stock. But she was already gone. She moved with inhuman speed. Now she was by the bed, smirking. A mortal who thinks he can kill the immortal. Margaret shook her head. How amusing. But Ben wasn't here to play games. He yanked a pouch of salt from his pocket and flung it into her face. Shh! Her skin sizzled, as if burned by acid. Margaret screamed. She clawed at her face, stumbling back. Ben didn't wait. He grabbed one of the acid bottles from the table, smashed it against the dresser, and threw it straight at her chest. Margaret shrieked, the sound splitting the air. Her flesh melted, revealing muscle, ribs, organs. She collapsed to her knees, convulsing. Ben lifted the shotgun, aimed it at her face. "Hell is waiting for you," he whispered. He pulled the trigger. Boom. And then, a voice behind him. "I knew you'd be trouble, Ben." The blood froze in his veins. Slowly, he turned. Victor stood in the doorway. Fire. Powerful. His eyes burned with an icy abyss. He shut the door behind him. And now, Ben understood. Margaret wasn't the real enemy. He was. Victor. The Alpha. The true monster. Victor took a step forward. "You killed my family." Ben said nothing. He just raised the shotgun and fired. Boom! The bullet struck Victor straight in the chest. He staggered, but didn't fall. Just slowly looked down at the hole in his body, then back at Ben, and smiled. "Is that all you've got?" Then Ben felt it. Victor's gaze, like thousands of icy needles piercing his mind. The world blurred. He was no longer in the room. He was in darkness. Whispers surrounded him. His body was paralyzed by an unseen force. Victor stepped closer. His voice was velvet, dangerous. "Sleep, Ben. Sleep." His consciousness started to fade. His eyelids grew heavier. His body refused to obey. He was falling. He was dying. Ben woke up to searing, unbearable pain. At first, he didn't understand. His mind still drifted in darkness. His muscles were limp, as if his body no longer belonged to him. But the pain was real. It was cold. But inside, he was burning. Something wet and sticky dripped down his skin. Something moved. He groaned, trying to shift, but his body wouldn't obey. Where was he? What? Then he heard it. A wet squelch, a sickening crunch, the sound of chewing. He blinked, struggling to focus his vision. Shadows danced before his eyes. A familiar room, wooden floors, the smell of blood. Memories flooded back. Victor, hypnosis, darkness. And then, he realized. Something was tearing into his leg. He turned his head and saw her. Margaret. She knelt beside his legs, her head bowed, long tangled hair hiding her face. Her fingers dug into his flesh. Her mouth was red. She was eating him. He jerked, trying to escape, but she gripped him tighter. "Shh, hush now, little one." Her voice was thick with pleasure. She sank her teeth deeper. Ben screamed. She ripped away chunks of meat, gnawing at his thigh, savoring his blood, and something inside him snapped. His eyes filled with pain, with fury, with terror. Then he heard something else. Laughter. Deep. Calm. He turned his head slowly. Victor. He sat on the bed, lounging back, fingers laced together. His icy eyes studied Ben, like a predator studies its prey. "I'm sorry I didn't let you die right away," Victor said softly. "But you see, we haven't had fresh human meat in so long. We couldn't afford to be wasteful." He gestured toward Margaret. "She's almost dead, anyway. You managed to take her down. Well done." Ben clenched his teeth, struggling not to scream as Margaret sank her teeth into his calf, tearing away a chunk of flesh. Victor smiled. "She's dying," he said. "But you're saving her, don't you see?" Ben couldn't speak. He could only stare at Victor, at the monster standing before him. "Your flesh heals us," Victor murmured, stepping forward, standing over him. "You knew that, didn't you, Ben? Ghouls don't just eat meat. They absorb power, energy, life." He leaned down, running his cold fingers along Ben's cheek. "And you're so strong, Ben, such a rare find." Ben's breathing grew deeper. Anger, stronger than pain, stronger than fear. He knew Margaret was weak. He had almost killed her. But now she was healing. On his flesh. His flesh. No! With wild, rabid fury, he lunged forward. His fingers wrapped around the first thing they found, the shattered remains of the acid bottle. He didn't think. He just acted. Whoosh! The sharp edge of the broken glass plunged into Margaret's throat. She shrieked, eyes widening in shock. Blood splattered. Dark. Dirty. She gurgled, clutching her throat. Ben twisted the glass deeper, a sickening sizzle. The acid burned her from the inside. Her body began to rot apart. Her face melted. She convulsed on the floor, writhing in agony. But Ben didn't even look at her. He was watching Victor. For the first time. Victor wasn't smiling. For the first time. He looked surprised. Ben stood up, limping. His leg was mangled, blood dripping down his skin. But he stood. He reached into his pocket. His fingers were slick with blood. He gripped the flashlight and turned it on. A blinding beam of light flooded the room, straight into Victor's eyes. Victor roared, stumbling back, his face twisted, hands raising to shield himself. His hypnosis was broken. He was blind. Ben stepped forward. "It's over, Victor." His voice was ice. "Your turn." And he struck the first blow. Victor laughed, loud, sharp, insane. Ben gripped the flashlight, its beam aimed straight into the monster's eyes. But Victor didn't move, didn't try to dodge. He just laughed. "You think you've won?" His voice was full of genuine amusement. Ben stared at him, unblinking. But inside, fear. Raw, primal, all-consuming fear. He shouldn't be laughing. He should be roaring in pain. Ben aimed the flashlight directly at his face again. "Burn, you bastard." Victor squinted, as if the blinding light was just an inconvenience, not something that should be incinerating him from the inside. "You're so amusing, Ben." He stepped forward, right into the beam, right into the light. His eyes gleamed, bright yellow flames. "You're afraid, aren't you?" Ben breathed heavily. He knew. He couldn't show fear. But Victor saw it, felt it. Ghouls sensed fear like predators smelled fresh blood. "You're just a blind kitten," Victor mused, "who thought he could slay a dragon." Another step forward. Ben stepped back. The flashlight trembled in his hands. "This is pointless." Victor tilted his head. "You fought well, killed my family. That's impressive." His smile stretched wider. "But I am not them." He vanished, just gone, as if he had never stood there at all. Ben gasped, whipping his head around. His heart pounded. Where was he? Where was he? Through the rush of blood in his ears, he heard it. Breathing, right behind him, warm, deep. "You're finished, Ben." Ben lunged forward, trying to escape, but the grip was instant. Victor's fingers clamped around his wrist. He didn't even bother punching, just squeezed. Crack. Bone snapped like a dry twig. Ben screamed. The flashlight slipped from his grasp. Victor hurled him across the room. Ben slammed into the wall, collapsed onto the floor. The world spun. His arm, useless. Victor approached slowly. "You know," he murmured, leaning over him. "You remind me of a boy I ate 20 years ago." He lifted Ben by the throat, raising him off the ground. Ben gasped, struggling for air. "He thought he could defeat me too," Victor murmured. He leaned in closer. He was wrong, too. His grip tightened. The world began to fade. But then, suddenly, through the darkness, a thought surfaced. The house. The Reeves house. It was their hive, their fortress, their lair. And what do you do to a beast's lair when you can't kill the beast itself? You burn it down. Ben couldn't defeat Victor, but he could destroy everything. His trembling fingers reached into his pocket. The lighter. He remembered. Sophie burning. The stench of her scorching hair, her screams, fire, their weakness. Not even ghouls could withstand fire. He yanked the lighter out. Click. A spark. A flame. Victor didn't realize it at first, but then his eyes widened. Ben managed a smirk. "You're no dragon." He dropped the lighter into the shattered bottles of alcohol, into the dark pool of gasoline he had spilled across the floor, while Victor toyed with him. Ignition. Fire erupted like a ravenous beast, devouring the carpet, the furniture, the walls. Victor roared. His skin bubbled. He flung Ben aside, staggering back, clutching his face. The flames spread fast. Ben barely stood, but he knew. There was no escape. The house was already burning. Everything was ablaze. Victor screamed. But he was still alive. Ben didn't let him escape. He lunged forward, collided with him. Victor stumbled. They both fell. Into the raging inferno. Agony. Fire licked at his skin, but Ben held on. Victor thrashed. Ben clenched his grip tighter. "No," he whispered. "You burn with me." The flames surged higher. The roof caved in. Fire consumed them both. Victor's final scream was swallowed by the collapsing walls. Everything disappeared. Everything burned. And there were no more monsters. Ben couldn't kill Victor, but he could erase him. He burned the house down, along with himself. The ghouls were gone, but at what cost? Subscribe to the channel to receive new horror stories before bed. Like, write in the comments who at what time does not sleep under our audiobook.